Thanks for the invitation. My name is Ned Blackhawk. I'm Associate Professor of History and American Indian Studies, and I've been working here on campus for 9 years now. Well, people have a general misconception that the Western Great Lakes region was removed from the processes of European contact and colonization that began really with the Spanish in the late 15th century and early 16th century across the Caribbean. There were very profound disruptions that reshaped the Siouan, Algonquian, and to a lesser extent and later Iroquoian-speaking peoples in the Western Great Lakes, beginning in the late 15 and early 1600s. Subsequently, several generations of extreme conflict and ultimately generations of subsequent compromise between various fur trading and resident native communities created a mutually constructed shared world that then faced a torrent of challenges with the arrival of English speakers beginning in the 1750s and 60s. The subsequent independence of the United States created a subsequent process of ultimately dispossession for the vast majority of the region's native populations, ultimately creating the conditions for Euro-American settlement throughout the upper Mississippi region. Early American Republic, despite its contemporary status, was in fact very weak and divided. We have a brutal and nearly cataclysmic unraveling of the American nation in the middle of the 19th century. And in the earliest decades of the American Republic, there was an enormous amount of uncertainty, confusion, and concern about the future of the Republic. So to enshrine a stronger centralized federal government, the framers of the American Constitution specifically included the supremacy of the federal government over Indian affairs in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. That power ultimately sets in motion the precedent for establishing treaties between the federal government and the nation's Indian peoples, a process that is with us today, that was in the minds of the framers in the earliest days of the nation. That process becomes one of enormous, often sacrifice and loss for Indian peoples who are ceding away millions of acres of their homelands to the federal government. That process also has a modicum of protections written into it for the protection of native communities from the deluge of white settlement around them. A modicum of protections that ultimately establish a government-to-government set of relationships between federal representatives and Indian nations that characterizes the contemporary era. But people have a general misunderstanding of that unique relationship that all federally recognized tribes, including the 11 and soon 12 in the state of Wisconsin, have with the federal government. Well, following the heavy settlement of particularly southern and central Wisconsin, the native communities in the state faced really a series of nearly epic challenges, retaining the kind of primary subsistence economies on the one hand while preserving their own cultural traditions and sense of place and well-being in the world on the other, made for a very trying time not only for this state but for really every state's native communities. And the process of settlement often brought with it a very high level of expectation on behalf of this territorial and then later state leaders that the native communities would ultimately adapt and adopt many of the requisite forms of life that the Euro-American communities are bringing with them. That means manners of dress, manners of speech, manners of being that are ultimately often at odds with many of these communities' primary traditions and behaviors. So those processes of particularly adaptation, but also adoption or forced adoption or assimilation brought harrowing loss and difficulty to many communities who saw, as we all know, many of their children taken from them and sent away to boarding schools, who saw the imposition of foreign economies and political structures for them, and just a kind of chaotic and profound sense of unfamiliarity in their homelands with the kind of changing circumstances around them. Well, if we step back from our current period, it's really just one elderly person's lifetime to the dawn of the 20th century and into the early decade and a half of the 20th century. If we go back to essentially our grandparents' earliest days and look at the world that they confronted, and fast forward to our contemporary era, we see a world of really remarkable contrasts as well as certain continuities. Those contrasts are really under-recognized forms of American achievement that really all Americans would be well-served understanding. The literally poorest of the poor, the most marginal, economically challenged communities on the American continent, North American continent, have, some of them have overcome generations of harrowing impoverishment, political subordination, religious persecution, and various forms of other kind of marginalization to become not only active, but in many ways leading contributors of their regional and even national economies. You look at the Seminole Nation of Florida purchasing the Hard Rock Casino and a resort chain. Here in Wisconsin, we have three of the most prosperous Indian nations on the continent with the Ho-Chunk, Oneida, and Forest County Potawatomi. These are really a sea change of rapid and profound historical transformations that many people don't really fully understand and don't really have a vocabulary to discuss. It's our job here on campus to really provide those levels of analytical and kind of just normative understandings so that all of our students can become well-informed participants in this rapidly changing world.